Is it on? Yeah. All my life, I've eaten the buttery spice cookies called speculoos from a recipe that my Dutch grandma, Joan Tymstra, passed to our whole family. In Holland, they're holiday cookies, but my mom makes them year-round because they're just too good. And when she makes them, the whole kitchen fills up with this warm cloud of cinnamon and nutmeg and allspice and cloves, and it's just the best. Now, traditionally, speculoos are pressed into molds, the windmill being the most familiar here in the States, but there are many, many others going back hundreds of years. There are ships, there are heads of state, animals, and St. Nicholas, who's the forerunner of Santa Claus, of course. But the molds are a lot of trouble. They stick, you can't get them out, you can't get the cookies out. And plus, if you add slivered almonds and candied ginger, like we like to do, it's too bumpy for the design to show. So instead, we just pat them into logs and slice them, and we figure, you know, it's less trouble, more flavor. So it's the way we go. Now, I am guessing that my grandma brought her speculoos recipe with her when she came to the US in the 1920s. My grandma, lived well into her 90s. She was 94 when she died. And she was the kindest, humblest lady with soft, wrinkly cheeks and snowy white hair tied in a little bun with a big red streak on one side. And she had a really self-effacing, apologetic little giggle whenever she talked. And I have always thought of her people, my Dutch side, as essentially gentle, kind, slow-moving folk who love sweets and good cheese. And, you know, even her family crest is peaceful. There's no armor, there's no snarling lions. It's a bunny on a sand dune. It's really true. So essentially, speculoos for me have always been a gift from distant ancestors in a land of tulips and windmills. They've never been anything but a delight. And so in that spirit, I baked a batch of speculoos for all of you to try, and they're in your programs, and if you would like, you can open your programs now, and they're in that little envelope that says, "Don't eat me," but now you can. So while you're trying them, I'll tell you about another batch of cookies, speculoos, that I baked not too long ago. I was invited to something called an ancestral potluck, and and I brought speculoos, and part of the deal with the ancestral potluck is that you talk about the history of your recipe. And I realized that I did not know the history of this recipe, and even more than that, I didn't know anything really about my Dutch heritage, which was odd. So I started to explore it. I come from a family who look always forward, never back, and I realized that this was kind of odd. So I started digging into it, and I learned that the spices that make speculoos so delicious are native to Indonesia, which is where my grandmother was born in 1892 into a colonial family in what was then called the Dutch East Indies. And in fact, spices were the reason the Dutch went there in the first place. At the time that they first went, the end of the 15th century, nutmeg, mace, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper had been prized luxuries in Europe ever since medieval times. And the prices were ridiculous. Really insane, because the supply routes were so long and nobody knew exactly where these spices came from. There was a series of trades made all along these routes, and it took 2 years to get the spices to Europe. And at one point, nutmeg was worth more than gold, and in part because people thought it cured the plague. So it set off a kind of mania for spices, and Europeans became desperate to cut out the middlemen and get right to the Spice Islands themselves. And so they started trying to figure out a way to get to the Spice Islands, and finally in the 1500s they did. Now, the Spice Islands are now called the Malukus, and they're an incredibly beautiful and very remote volcanic archipelago, thousands of miles from Jakarta. Back in the 1500s, this was the only place in that circle there, the only place in the world where nutmeg and clove trees grew. And they grew on a handful of islands within that chain, and the islands are too tiny for you to even see. And it was said that the nutmeg and clove trees were so fragrant that you could smell their scent from 10 miles offshore. Now, the first Europeans to arrive were the Portuguese, followed by the Spanish, the English, and finally the Dutch, who came at the end of the 1500s and set up the Dutch East India Company. Now, as I was researching, I learned that the Dutch were not peaceful and kind. They were ruthless. Their goal was total monopoly, which they achieved through massacre and torture, both of the European competition and the local population. One of the bloodiest episodes was in 1621 on the Banda Islands, home to nutmeg, where they wiped out or enslaved nearly 15,000 Bandanese. The Dutch East India Company also made a vast amount of money for its shareholders because, in fact, it is now considered the world's first multinational corporation, built on exploitation and extraction. As wealth from the spice trade poured into Holland, the supply of spices stepped up too, naturally, and ordinary Dutch cooks could now bake speculaas, which had been a rare treat in the past. So you had a situation in which home bakers were pulling these rich, spicy little cookies out of their ovens at the same time that terrible acts of oppression were making that possible. My grandmother never talked about her colonial childhood with my mother, and she had no photos either. Her sister, though, my great-aunt Wilhelmina, had a son named Jack, and my mom thought he might still be around, though probably close to 90. So I tracked him down through Facebook. And it turned out he was alive and well and living in San Leandro, 45 minutes from my house. And he and his wife had a trove of old photos going back to the 1800s. And now these are my grandmother's parents, my great-grandparents, Justinus Cornelis and Jacoba Cornelia Voordijn. As far as we know, they were the first of our family to arrive in the Dutch East Indies in 1890. Now, by that time, the Dutch East India Company was long gone, and my great-grandfather was a civil engineer building roads and dams. The times were not as brutal as they had been, but the colonial structure continued. This is my great-aunt Wilhelmina with her nursemaid. And here she is, carried in a sedan chair on an outing to a volcano in East Java. My grandma left Java as a teenager to go to school in Holland and never went back. My great-aunt, though, stayed with her family, and in 1942, when the war broke out and the Japanese invaded, she and her husband and her son and their son Jack were put into internment camps, and they lost everything they had. After the war, they joined my grandmother in California, and the Dutch East Indies became independent Indonesia. So, speculaas. Colonialism in a cookie. So, what does it mean when a grandchild of colonists, like me, grows up knowing nothing about all of this, for whom eating a cookie has been a purely unconscious pleasure? The novelist David Foster Wallace famously told a story about an old fish who swims past two young fish and says to them, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And one young fish looks at the other one and says, "What the hell is water?" I'm still trying to process what I've learned and how I ought to carry it with me. I have more questions than I have answers, and I'm still finding stuff out. Certainly, cruelty is not confined to the Dutch, but it doesn't really matter. Their relative comfort in life, from which I, as their descendant, have doubtless benefited, was built on accepting the oppression of others as normal, as imperceptible as water is to a fish. How can that change? I'll always love my family, and speculoos are delicious, but now I taste their history too. Thank you.